Good afternoon. Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, co-chair of the Steering and Policy Committee, along with my colleague, Congressman Andrews of New Jersey, and are pleased to convene this policy hearing this afternoon, a conversation on race and justice in America. I want to thank you all for being here today. It's a privilege to welcome you. Thank the members of our distinguished panel, who we will introduce in a moment. Thank you so much for joining us today. 50 years now since Dr. Martin Luther King's famous address at the Lincoln Memorial, and in fact we have seen progress towards racial justice since then. But as Dr. King once said, one of the sure signs of maturity is the ability to rise to the point of self-criticism. And as recent events have made clear yet again, we still have a lot of self-reflection and criticism to do. Several statistics which I think are important that we need to consider, and that's unemployment today is an unacceptable 7.6% overall. For African Americans, it is close to double that, 13.7%. 1 in 6 Americans now lives under the poverty line, the highest it's been since 1993. That includes 28% of African Americans and 40% of African American children. The disparities persist, not just in our economy, but also, sadly, in our justice system. For example, while African Americans make up about 15% of the nation's drug users, they are 37% of those arrested, 59% of those convicted, and 74% of those sentenced to prison for a drug offense. That is not right. I hope today we can talk honestly about these continuing and unjust disparities in America, how we can better work to resolve them. Only if we deal with these problems in a forthright manner, work together, listen to each other in a spirit of self-reflection, with humility and with love, we can continue to work towards our goal of a more equal and a more just nation. That is why we are here today. I thank you, and it is now my pleasure to yield to my colleague, Rob Andrews.
I thank my colleague, Ms. DeLauro. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In the painful aftermath of the verdict in Florida, we've heard a lot about stand your ground laws. We're here today because we have a stand your ground law. It's called the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it says that neither equal protection nor due process should be denied to any American at any time. But when the one place that minority youth seem to be most welcome is an unemployment line rather than a graduation line, we are here to stand our ground. When we have seen a decision from the United States Supreme Court that may undermine the underpinnings of affirmative action and roll back decades of progress, we believe it is time to stand our ground. Most of all, when we see the Voting Rights Act vandalized by the United States Supreme Court, opening the door to nefarious, exclusionary practices across this country, we know it is time to stand our ground. We have assembled a wonderful panel of witnesses to lead us through this discussion. We hope that it is the first in many steps that bends the arc toward the just result that we so much want. A leader of our caucus in our country who has spent her lifetime bending history toward the arc of justice is the leader of the House Democratic Caucus and the chair of this committee, Representative Pelosi from California.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rob Andrews, Congresswoman, Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro, to both of you for bringing us together this morning. We are here because the Congressional Black Caucus, which is called the conscience of the Congress, has challenged the conscience of the Congress. And Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, who is the chair of the committee, has been a great leader in helping to expand civil rights in our community and protecting voting rights for all, to expand the reach of opportunity for every American, regardless of race, to realize the ideal of equality, which is our heritage and our hope. She and others of the Congressional Black Caucus have that as their mantra, their North Star. And thank you, Congresswoman Fudge, for your leadership. I am pleased to, I'm going to yield to Mr. Clyburn, the assistant leader, and thank him for his leadership, which goes back decades in the civil rights movement. But today, to enhance and enrich our conversation, we are privileged to welcome 3 experts on the status of race relations in America. Maya Wiley, founder and president of Center for Social Inclusion, Morris Dees, founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize winner from the Washington Post. They will be introduced more fully, but I want to thank them because coming here equipped with the knowledge and expertise that they have, members of Congress can be better informed as we continue the conversation of race and justice in America. Now, I'm going to, before I yield to Mr. Clyburn, I'll say how honored I am that all of our colleagues are here. Our Vice Chair of the House the Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, Mr. Becerra, and our ranking member, once and future Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Conyers. With that, I want to thank Mr. Clyburn for his extraordinary leadership on this issue over decades, and pass the microphone to him.
Thank you very much, Madam Leader. And let me thank the co-chairs of the Steering and Policy Committee. Thank you so much for convening us here today, Chair Lady Fudge, other distinguished colleagues, and I want to welcome the panelists who are here. In a couple of days, we're going to pause here, I think, in Statuary Hall to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the great March on Washington. For some strange reason, we did not have a celebration of what I consider to be the publication of one of the most timeless documents ever written, and that's Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham City Jail. He wrote that letter a few months before that great march, and I've read that letter several times, and I'm often reminded of a portion of that letter which I think is very apropos here today. You may recall that letter was written in response to a letter he received from 8 clergymen, one of whom was from our native state, Gene, of South Carolina, Reverend Hardin. They asked him to leave Birmingham because they thought that he was a disruptive force. And they thought his timing was wrong, though his cause was right. King, in responding to them, said in his letter that he was coming to the conclusion that the people of ill will in our society make a much better use of time than the people of goodwill. And he concluded that thought by saying that we are going to be made to repent in this generation, not just for the vitriolic words and deeds of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. We're here today, hopefully, to break a silence that has permeated this country for a long time on this whole question of race and justice, Mr. Dees. The fact of the matter is, as Rowena Tobias, a matriarch down in Charleston, told me when I was still a young man getting started in this business, she said to me she thought that South Carolina's progress was hindered in large measure because we would sit down to solve every problem that existed in our society, save one, and that was race. She said to me she thought that every time the question of race surfaced, people would stop talking. And she asked me, please, don't stop talking, because we are not going to solve this problem until we learn to talk about it. And that's why we're here today. I would hope that events of recent days, as well as this here today, will jumpstart a very important dialogue on this whole question of race. I do believe that we can have some honest discussions. We can get beyond it. And with that, let me yield to our distinguished chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Marsha Fudge.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Leader and chairs of Steering and Policy, as well as Mr. Clyburn and all who are here. I am extremely pleased that we are having a hearing on a topic that has, for too long, been a thorn in the side of this nation. As we celebrate, as you talked about, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, many of the principles Dr. King and the multicultural coalition of people who joined him are being challenged today. Over the past few months, the foundation on which this country was built has been shaken. We've seen a key provision of the Voting Rights Act overturned. We've seen programs that work to close the gaps in educational, economic, and health opportunities come under attack. We've had a nation of people dealing with the consequences of losing their opportunity in the forms of overt institutional and structural injustice, but few people are willing to discuss these issues in a productive and constructive way. We must get serious about acknowledging the impact of racial profiling, violence, and inequitable treatment under the law is having on our communities, and of particular concern to me, having on our young people. We must be vocal and honest about the impact of attacks on our civil, constitutional, and economic rights, the rights that thousands of people of all races fought and died to protect. The emotion and the energy so many people, especially our young people, had around the Trayvon Martin tragedy, the attack on voting rights, the attack on feeding hungry people in this country, the attack on access to education, health care, and almost every other issue that matters to our lives must be channeled into the right place. Therefore, it is vital that we start and continue the conversation we will have today, and in the communities we all represent. I do believe it is our responsibility as elected leaders to convene those who will challenge the status quo and to provide certain factions in our society a broader platform from which they can express their concerns. I again thank Leader Pelosi, the co-chairs, and I thank all of our speakers for joining us today to provide their insight on the current state of race and justice in America and how we as a nation work toward moving in the right direction.
I'd like to really say a thank you to the panel and move to our introductions, and we are really very, very excited about your presence here and the work that you've done, and it gives me a great, great pleasure and an honor, really, of introducing a man who has devoted a long career to fighting poverty, racism, discrimination, injustice in America, Morris Dees, the co-founder and chief trial attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center. The son of an Alabama farmer, Morris witnessed firsthand the painful consequences of prejudice and racial injustice in our country. In 1971, after a decade of success in law and business, he sold a successful book publishing firm to start a civil rights law practice that would provide a voice for the disenfranchised and help to make the advances of the civil rights movement real on the ground. As a direct result of the early cases that the SPLC took, recreational facilities were desegregated, the Alabama legislature was reapportioned, and state troopers integrated, and the state prison system was reformed. In the decades since, SPLC has fought to dismantle institutional racism where it exists, reform the juvenile justice system, shatter barriers to equality for women, children, and the disabled, and protect low-wage immigrant workers from abuse. Morris Dees has been called one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America and has received many, many honors. In sum, Morris Dees has spent a long and a storied career working at the critical intersection of race and justice in American life and fighting to make a positive difference on the ground. We thank you so much, Mr. Dees, for being here today and for lending us your insights, your experience, and your expertise. Mr. Andrews?
I'm going to introduce Mr. Robinson, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, reporter, regular on Meet the Press and Hardball and the Rachel Maddow Show, and 25 years in various roles, rather, at the Washington Post. And while reporting abroad, Mr. Robinson has witnessed firsthand the revolution taking place online in the 24/7 news cycle, seen how the news media is influencing American culture. As one of the most prominent African-American intellectuals on the cultural scene and the author of Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America in 2010, he also shares with audiences his understanding of race relations in the United States and explains why many popular conceptions are now obsolete. His views are never obsolete, and we're very thankful he's with us today.
I'd like to recognize Marcia Fudge.
Thank you very much, and I have the pleasure of introducing Maya Wiley. Ms. Wiley is a leading author on the topic of racial equity. Most relevant to today's hearing, in 2012, she authored an article titled Talk About Race Right, The Why and How of Persuasive Race Talk for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies in their 2012 Focus magazine. Maya holds a JD from Columbia University School of Law and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Dartmouth College. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Ms. Wiley.
Thank you. And with that, we will begin the testimony from the witnesses, and we'll start with you, Mr. Dees, followed by Ms. Wiley, and followed by Mr. Robinson. Morris Dees.
Well, I want to thank the committee for inviting me here, and I come as a representative from the 43 lawyers and 200 other hardworking and dedicated workers at the Southern Poverty Law Center. I watched the Trayvon Martin case like most of you did. Being a lawyer, I was especially interested in the strategy of all the parties. The jury didn't quite look like the people sitting before me here. Had it, might have been a different result. But, you know, racial profiling is a secret hiding in public. And America is becoming increasingly armed and dangerous. And those two things make for a recipe for disaster. Juror number 37B, I think that's her number, said race was not involved. She said it was profiling of a potential criminal, essentially is what she said. Well, profiling is a PC word, politically correct word, that somebody in past generations would have just said simply race. But race is a major issue. And it doesn't matter to me whether people say, well, the murder rate is dropping drastically, and you can come up with all the statistics, whether it's 1 or 100 individuals who lose their life because of racial profiling, that's one too many. The Trayvon Martin case is, to me, in many ways, like the song, you've heard the 35th, and this is the 36th verse. Down in Jenner, Louisiana, I think many of you remember, a group of African-American students at a school that had about 15% black students wanted to stand under an oak tree where the white students gathered during recess. And the principal said, sure, but the next day, 3 nooses were found hanging from the tree. And not long afterwards, several African Americans, 6 in fact, got in some fights with the whites, and they were extremely overcharged, charged with assault with intent to murder. And Jesse Jackson said it was a defining moment, this incident, when 20,000 people brought by Al Sharpton there to demonstrate. Jesse said it was kind of like Selma, a defining moment. And there were hearings at this Congress building. House Judiciary Committee had hearings. Little has changed. Fortunate to say, the Southern Poverty Law Center represented and provided counsel for these 6 people involved in this case, and all of them but one got out with serving no time, and that one served a small amount of time. You know, I think we talked about the Supreme Court recently and its decision striking down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. Well, our Supreme Court has led the way on racial profiling because they're unwilling to say that the emperor has no clothes on. Let me just read you quickly a case, this U.S. Supreme Court rule in 1987, McCleskey versus basically the state of Georgia. And this death row inmate in Georgia said, look, wait a minute, African Americans seem to get the death penalty more than whites, etc., and those who kill whites tend to have the harshest punishment. And a guy named Baldus, a famous sociologist, put together an enormous study which showed that was really true. But here's what the Supreme Court said in upholding this poor man's death penalty, this African American's death penalty. They said this: the study indicates that the death penalty in Georgia was imposed more often on black defendants and killers of white victims than on white defendants and killers of black victims. But it failed to establish that any of the decision makers in the defendant's case acted with discriminatory purpose in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And the study at the most indicated a discrepancy that appeared to correlate with race, not a constitutionally significant risk of racial bias affecting Georgia's capital punishment system. Correlated with race. I don't know how you've stated any clearer than what the study was supposed to show. One, in the Columbia Law Review article in 2008, a noted writer wrote that that race should not be considered to have to be a motive. Just look at its historical history. And I think that's what we're really talking about here today. There were so many talking heads that you get tired of watching them after the Trayvon Martin verdict came in and Zimmerman, and it was like, was it racial, was it not, da-da-da-da-da, but on and on and on. But let me tell you, clearly race was involved in this situation. And I'm not sure from a legal standpoint what this jury could do with Florida's law and the way the jury was charged, but the jury of public opinion in America, I think, was flabbergasted at the results. But unfortunately, about over half of white people thought that the jury verdict was accurate, and over half of the African Americans thought it was an inaccurate verdict. And surprisingly, a lot of black people agreed with the guilty verdict, around 30-something%, which is surprising to me too. You know, before I throw out a couple of ideas, and I'm really looking forward to the questions, answers from you more than anything, I grew up on a small cotton farm where race was critical. It was the only issue. It was Jim Crow. African Americans had no rights in any particular area. I sued to integrate the Alabama State Troopers with other lawyers at the center when 3 different instances, African American I represented was beaten up and pistol whipped in Georgia before he shot 2 state troopers who were doing it, and I did the same thing in Alabama in 2 other cases. And then I finally represented a young man, a MP in the military, who came back to be a state trooper and wanted to integrate George Wallace's 685 white trooper force. And finally that integrated the Alabama State Troopers. I hope your questions deal somewhat with the solutions of this, and I can throw out some answers, and my time is running out here. But at the Law Center, we see the solutions to these issues involving race and justice is not simple. They involve many things, and some of those things we're working on. Education is the major one. We filed lawsuits in Jackson, Mobile, Birmingham, Jefferson Parish, and several in Florida, trying to stop the expulsion of African American students, particularly males, for status offenses. And we also indicated have a program dealing with positive behavioral things that schools can use, and we certainly can provide those with the committee. Trayvon Martin was himself not in school at the time. He had been dismissed from school because of some status offense, and maybe had he been in school, he wouldn't have been in the line of fire. But I do hope that at some point, and I'll just kind of lay this out, I hope that Congress should pass an act in the name of Trayvon Martin to address the issues of racial profiling. The act would condition the state receipts of federal funds for highway construction and drug interdiction and other programs on the establishment of programs to root out racial profiling by the police. I don't think that's all Congress should do, but I think that would be a good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley.
Thank you, distinguished members of Congress, for your leadership. I feel lifted by your leadership and saddened that we have to sit here today. But it's such an important conversation, and I wanted to actually start with a story. My cousin, who I revere, is a huge fan of Congresswoman Fudge's, so as soon as I knew I was going to be testifying, I texted her and let her know. And I told her what I would be testifying about because I knew my stock in my family would increase dramatically. And so I immediately got back from her a story that I hadn't heard that was in fact in the news from Lexington, Kentucky, where she used to live. A 23-year-old college student jumped out of his car to have a fight with 2 other young men who were also in a car. A fight happened, and the 23-year-old college student was shot and killed. And the shooter was not prosecuted for the shooting. Now that might sound fairly straightforward in the way I just told it, which was much of the way the news reported it. But the way my cousin told me was very different, because her 2 stepdaughters went to high school with the young man who was killed. The young man who was killed was black, and he hopped out of his car because the 2 men in the car who he got out of the car to fight with, had actually hurled a racial epithet at him. And it turns out that one of the 2 white men in the car hurled the racial epithet because he was, in fact, dating the white ex-girlfriend of one of the young men in the car. So when you hear the story that way, it becomes a slightly different story. And let me tell you one other aspect to it. My cousin's black. Her 2 stepdaughters are white. So it both shows us the incredible strides we've made in this country because, one, my cousin has 2 beautiful stepdaughters who are white with whom she is extremely close. And 2, that these 2 young white women were friends with this young African-American man because they went to high school together. And their understanding of the dynamic between the men who shot him and this young man is very, very different as a result. Now, that is what I would call overt racism, right? That's just straight up, old style, threw out a racial epithet, no protection for someone who was certainly, any of us who receives a racial epithet or another kind of epithet, they're fighting words. But what's deadly force? When can you actually kill someone because one man is going after two others, right? Not 1, 2. But I want to move on to race, because one of the things that we need to distinguish today is race versus racism. Now, let me say up front, racism is on the increase in the United States, and that's a very sad and unfortunate fact. The Associated Press did a study with a leading psychologist in 2012 that found that the increase in negative attitudes towards blacks as negative has increased from 48% when President Obama was elected to office to 51% in 2012. That is an increase in overt stereotyping, negative stereotyping of black people. Unfortunately, we don't have measures for Latinos, for Native Americans. I would suspect that we would actually see similar patterns, particularly when we think about the conversations we've had around immigration. Nonetheless, the point here is that that same study went deeper and looked at something that I would say is race that we need to distinguish, and that is implicit bias. We have 2 decades of social science that actually show us that our laws and policies have not kept pace with our understanding of the human brain. So here is your brain on race. Your brain on race is that 56% of Americans actually have, in that same AP study, 56% have negative attitudes towards black people that they do not know they have necessarily, right? Now that's something that's very different. So when we hear a juror in the George Zimmerman case say, this isn't about race, there's something that's actually not surprising in the cognitive science about that. Because quite frankly, most people in this country do not believe that racism is okay. And when they hear racist statements, they think that's wrong and something should be done about it. And are completely unconscious as to the ways in which our images, our constant images of young black men being arrested, or our constant images of Latinos being handcuffed at the border, or our constant images of a drunken Native American, or our constant images of Muslims as terrorists, right? Even our images of women, people based on sexual orientation, we carry many, many kinds of biases as a result of what we see and actually how we structure society. So this is very important because the difference between racism is you're wrong and you know you're wrong. The difference with race is that people believe the right things and don't recognize that their brain is acting like computer software. It spits out an answer that you respond to in a nanosecond without you seeing all the circuitry and all the algorithms that are leading to that action, right? And our laws do not reflect that. Now, there's tons of evidence, and I have a lot of it in my written testimony, so I won't go through it all. But let me just say that after 2 decades of studies, here's what we know. If you are a black child in a school, you are likely to have a teacher who has a lower expectation of your academic performance, and that has an impact on your academic performance. If you are a pediatrician with implicit bias, you are less likely to prescribe pain medication to your patient when they report pain. And if you are a police officer, or actually a college student in a trial test, you are more likely to shoot a black person holding up a wallet or a cell phone than a white person holding up a wallet or a cell phone. And none of these things are because you intend that impact. And let me share one other thing that's so important about this. A lot of conversations that we had and we heard before, during, and after the trial of George Zimmerman was, he's Latino. Stop talking about race. How can he be racist because he's Latino? Well, once again, what we fail to understand that the science recognizes is we all have implicit bias. Actually, in the implicit associations test, which is one of the premier tests that have been run for decades, more than 2 million people have taken this test, tons of evidence. One of the things it shows us is that, in fact, 42% of black respondents have a preference for whites and negative black attitudes. So it isn't something that is reserved only to a particular race, even. So we can't even understand, if someone black thinks it's not about race, or if someone black thinks that stereotype is true, that does not make it true. So I want to end with, what does this mean? Because as I've said, there are several reasons why we have implicit bias. And one is that we have made so much progress on the conscious front, meaning we have said as a society, and we deeply share and believe, that it is wrong to judge someone by their appearance or their religion or their sexual orientation, hopefully most of us, including the Pope now. It is wrong to make that judgment. They should be judged on their actions, right? And yet we're constantly making judgments that do not reflect an actual judgment of action. And that's when Mr. Dees talks about juries and why it's so important for them to be reflective. It's because we have seen from a decade of studies in Florida that even one black juror on a jury has decreased the conviction rates of black defendants and increased the conviction rates of white defendants, so that we don't see racial disparities in jury verdicts, at least in the 2 counties that in Florida where this was tested. So what that tells us is a few things. Diversity matters, and our policies that support diversity, whether it's affirmatively furthering our fair housing rules as HUD is currently doing, whether it's finding ways to ensure that we're all living together, going to school together in non-competitive community activity, that actually has a huge impact as far as the social science on actually changing how some of these implicit biases work. The more we live together, work together, the more we are able to bypass some of this circuitry and create new neural pathways. And that should be true for all of us, right? I mean, it also, there's another point here, and I know this Congress has been fighting about a lot of these issues. We don't understand why we see the poverty and exclusion that we see in black communities, or Latino communities, or Native American communities. If we understood them, we would no longer necessarily make the connection that the people must be bad. I'll give one example. I could give many more, but just one from some of the research that's out there. 2/3 of all low and moderate skilled jobs in our 100 largest metropolitan areas are more than 90 minutes from public transit. And blacks and Latinos are 6 times more likely to be without a car. And transportation costs are more expensive than almost all our household costs put together. Which means when we look at a community of high poverty, we don't see that we failed to make the investments that would create the opportunity for those community members to get to the jobs they could get. And when we talk about the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, 21 of the states that are opting out hold almost 60% of the African Americans in this country who are uninsured and would benefit from Medicaid expansion. And so when we wonder why childhood obesity rates are high, and when we wonder why people wait and go to the emergency room, rather than passing a judgment, I hope that we can have a conversation about how we invest in each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you so much. Leader Pelosi, Congresswoman DeLauro, Chairwoman Fudge, I can't name all of the distinguished members of Congress up here and my friends and heroes, or I'll take up all my time. But thank you so much for the privilege of addressing you today. It's a great honor. This is a new experience for me, a new vantage point, sitting at the table in what is often the hot seat, thanks to you. I come here today, as always, as a journalist, but I come here also as an African-American father of 2 sons, and as a native South Carolinian who grew up during the Civil Rights Movement and the tumultuous final throes of Jim Crow. I come here today as a journalist and author, having dedicated much of my professional life to trying to further our difficult national conversation on race. And by the way, this, I believe, is the way we are fated to have that conversation. Something happens, an event that commands our attention, shocks our collective conscience, that touches a nerve. And so we talk and we argue and we shout. We write our columns and convene our hearings, and eventually we turn to other things and the conversation dies out. And it seems as if we've gotten nowhere. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes we do make progress, though we might not recognize that progress for some time. It's an uncomfortable process, but this is how the conversation works. And we all know what events sparked this round of the conversation, the slaying of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman. I'd like to read just a few of the words that I wrote following the verdict, because I think they are relevant to the question of race and justice in America. Justice failed Trayvon Martin the night he was killed. We should be appalled and outraged, but perhaps not surprised that it failed him again, with a verdict setting his killer free. George Zimmerman was acquitted because this society considers young black men to be dangerous, interchangeable, expendable, guilty until proven innocent. The acquittal was set in motion on February 26, 2012, before Martin's body was even cold. When Sanford, Florida police arrived on the scene, they encountered a grown man who acknowledged killing an unarmed 17-year-old boy. They did not arrest the man or test him for drug or alcohol use. They conducted a less than energetic search for forensic evidence. They hardly bothered to look for witnesses. Even after 6 weeks had elapsed, evidence was found to justify arresting Zimmerman and putting him on trial, but the chance of definitively and independently establishing what happened that night was probably lost. The only complete narrative was Zimmerman's. Trayvon Martin, at the time of his death, was 3 weeks past his 17th birthday, but black boys in this country are not allowed to be children. They are assumed to be men, even at a tender age, and to be full of menace. I don't know if the jury, which included no African Americans, consciously or unconsciously bought into this racist way of thinking, but it hardly matters, because police and prosecutors initially did. The assumption was that Zimmerman had the right to self-defense, but Martin, young male black, did not. The assumption was that Zimmerman might fear for his life in a hand-to-hand struggle, but Martin, young male black, would not. If anyone wonders why African Americans feel so passionately about this case, it's because we know that our 17-year-old sons are boys, not men. It's because we know their adolescent bravado is just that, an imitation of manhood, not the real thing. We know how frightened our sons would be if they were walking home alone on a rainy night and realized they were being followed. We know how torn they would be between a child's fear and a child's immature idea of manly behavior. We know how they would struggle to decide which was the right course of action, flight or fight. And we know that a skinny boy, armed only with a bag of candy, no matter how big and bad he tries to seem, does not pose a mortal threat to a healthy adult man who outweighs him by 50 pounds and has had martial arts training, albeit in vain. We know that the boy may well have threatened the man's pride, but hardly his life. The conversation we need to have is about how black men are denied the right to be boys. As an example, whites and blacks are equally likely to smoke weed, but blacks are 4 times more likely to be jailed on marijuana charges. There is no rational reason for the disparity. I think it's because of racism. What do you think? Those words were written from the heart, but the facts that back them up are there for any dispassionate observer to examine. Justice is not colorblind because our society is not colorblind, and laws that have no intrinsic racial content can become instruments of discrimination. In this regard, I'm especially concerned about the stand your ground laws. And we should recall that the laudable purpose of these laws initially, in many cases, was to protect women from violently abusive spouses by essentially establishing that they had no obligation to retreat. But the practical effect, as we saw in the Trayvon Martin case, can be warped by race. George Zimmerman did not claim stand your ground at his trial, but he didn't have to because he was already accorded the benefit of the doubt given by stand your ground at the time of the incident. That benefit of the doubt was given to him, and there was no taking it back. And so the decision about who gets to stand his ground and who doesn't is literally a matter of life and death. I'm also deeply concerned about the glaring racial disparity in arrests and incarcerations for minor drug offenses. My time is running out, but I'll just one other figure. African Americans represent 26% of juvenile arrests. Now that's already out of proportion with the African American share of the population, but 26% of juvenile arrests. From there, it jumps to 58% of youth admitted to state prisons. And so even black youth are twice as likely as they should be to be arrested in the first place, and then twice as likely again to go to prison for the same offenses. So we'll get into more facts and figures in question and answer, I'm sure. I just close with my sincere thanks to all of you for convening this hearing and for continuing the quest for racial justice, whose arc, sadly, is longer than any of us had hoped. Thank you.
May I just ask our colleagues to express appreciation to the very excellent testimony of I want to just acknowledge our members who are here. We're very honored with the presence of Representative John Lewis, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Karen Bass was here. She may be coming back. Congressman G.K. Butterfield, our chair, as I mentioned earlier, Javier Becerra, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, the chair, as we know, the CBC, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, freshman member, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, another member of the freshman class, Congressman Ted Deutsch, Congressman Keith Ellison, Congresswoman Donna Christensen, our chairman has been acknowledged, Congressman John Conyers, and Congressman Henry Cuellar. When we get to our comments, Congressman Greg Meeks is back here, our overflow. When we get to our comments, I want to remind our colleagues that I took 1 minute, and that may be all we can each have to put our ideas on the table to get the proper time from ours. But I want to acknowledge that we have been joined by our distinguished House Democratic Whip and champion on civil rights, Steny Hoyer. Steny.
Thank you so much, and thank you for convening this. Marcia, thank you for your leadership, and thank the Congressional Black Caucus. There aren't enough white people at this rostrum. Racism is not simply about African Americans. It is, as Ms. Wiley pointed out, about the very psychology of our country. Morris, you deal with that on a regular basis. Racism is present in every one of our communities, and as you point out, Dr. Wiley, present in all of our minds, and we need to be conscious of that and confront it. And that's why I think this conversation is so important. I want to thank, of course, Eugene Robinson, who many of us who live in this area, and of course all of you who are visiting have the opportunity to read on a regular basis. He adds so much to the dialogue and has this conversation. This conversation is not new, and my speculation is it will never end. I don't know why that's the case, but if you read the Bible, thousands of years have gone by, and we're still having race about differences, about not the content of character, but the color of skin or the religion or the Irish all look alike. They have a different religion, and they tend to hate the other person that they're getting there. They're moving, but Shia and Sunni, You can just name so many examples. But here in America, race, of course, is the most visible, most evident difference between us. Gender as well, obviously. But I want to thank all three of you. Morris, I want to thank you for your extraordinary work through the decades. You've been a real hero. I've visited the center. I contribute. And I want to thank you for what you have done for such a long period of time as well to raise this issue, because we need to be conscious of it. We need to confront it. We need to deal with it. And we need to deal with the expectations of one another to overcome any of the connections that say somehow because somebody's different, they're not as good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. What we're going to do is to start the questioning, and I'm going to ask to start off the questioning is Congressman Becerra, Congressman Conyers, and I want to just repeat the leader's admonition about 1 minute each, and then we will recognize people as they came to the hearing. Congressman Becerra.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and to everyone who has attended this hearing, not just our witnesses, but those who've attended, we say thank you very much for your presence here today as well. With a minute, there's not a whole lot you could ask, but I will certainly say this. The day that we can invite 3 white witnesses to have this conversation is a day that we will have made the progress that I think all of us want to see. But I would ask you this, if you could give us a brief answer, what would you want to hear our brothers and sisters in the white community say that could help us make some progress, because most of us believe that it'd be very difficult to legislate attitude while we can do things to protect individuals' rights and freedoms. Attitude is something different, and I think you've been talking about how too many people carry not just a gun but attitude to an incident. And what could we ask, could we expect of some of those who continue to carry the attitude to say or do to try to change the circumstance that we face today?
I'm going to ask Chairman Conyers to ask his question same time so that we then can have you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering here what you see as the connection or relationship between racial justice and the electorate. You see, we spend a lot of time getting people to be educated and motivated and participating in the electoral process. And it seems to me that these two should be connected in some way, and I'd like your ideas on it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for those questions. They're very important. I will really speak, I think, more to Congressman Becerra's question, because I want to say 2 things. One, it absolutely is possible to legislate attitudes. It's because by legislating opportunity, you change how the attitudes are developed. So I think this chamber actually, current Congress notwithstanding, which is a different issue. But the fact that what laws we pass matter dramatically in terms of how we understand each other, whether we live together, whether we go to school together, what our schools look like, what our job opportunities are. You all make those decisions every day, and they do impact attitudes. So I want to thank you for your leadership in leading the charge on those things. I mean, I think the second thing, though, is what would I want to hear? One thing I just want to share, because I so appreciate what you said, Congressman Hoyer. After I had the incredible privilege of doing a lot of television after the verdict. But as a result, I had such an outpouring from emails, tweets, people saying, I am white, and I want you to know I'm now thinking about race differently. One doctor emailed me and said, I actually realize now that I listen more to you because you're light-skinned than I listen to someone who is black, who is dark-skinned. I think that's an amazing thing, right? The recognition itself actually starts to open up the opportunity on attitudes. So I have actually seen the one tragedy, this is a tragedy and a travesty. But one of the opportunities that is produced is for this discussion. The discussion matters. The fact that we've had this forum matters. The more people we can get this information out to, the more we will have more white people saying what I have heard from so many white Americans and so appreciate, which is, this isn't okay, and thank you because I'm thinking differently about what's going on.
I would just say that's that makes me feel good that you got those messages, because I got a few of those. But frankly, my email basket's a little different, because I heard from a disturbing number of people who wrote and said, you know, why don't you write about the real Trayvon Martin, and then sent that photograph of the rapper, The Game, which is not a photograph of Trayvon Martin, you know, a 30-year-old man with tattoos all over him, and you know, looks like maybe if Trayvon Martin, if he were, you know, twice his age and tattooed, but he's not. It's not, clearly not the same person yet. It's people who wanted to believe that, that the 17-year-old kid was actually this dangerous-looking 30-year-old man, and. So I hope the people who wrote you talk to the people who wrote me. And
I don't think they do.
Yeah, I wish they would. Just on Congressman Conyers' question about the politics and racial justice, I've always believed, with no empirical data, because I'm a journalist, not a social scientist, that the rise in a sort of vicious kind of racism or tone of racism that I've been perceiving, and I think others have perceived, is not unrelated to the economic uncertainty that so many Americans experience, to the hollowing out of the middle class, to you know, what has happened to the American dream as we understood it. And I think that situation creates anxieties that tend to sometimes get expressed in racial animus, in animus toward anyone who's different or anyone who seems to be a threat. And let's be honest, the inauguration of the first black president, the first African-American president, I think just brought this whole thing to a head for a lot of people, and in some ways, at least for some individuals, increased this anxiety, and that's all tied up in politics. I can't really untie the knot, but it's there, especially since if you were to look for commonality of economic interests, for example, I think you'd see a lot there between some people who and the people they want to dislike.
I think the changing demographics of our country is at play here in several respects. In 20, 25 years from now, we might not be meeting in this room talking about this subject, because America will be majority of people today who are minorities. Mm-hmm. And that'll change voting, it'll change everything. We're in a kind of a crunch period. I've studied the Aryan nations, the white Aryan resistance, the Klan, all these groups, and I used to read their evidence, their material they printed. I see their material and I use it against them in court to show they were likely to have encouraged a violent act. They did. Today, I don't have to go to their hate groups. I can just turn on some of the television, and some of their language is mainstreamed. What I found out dealing with these hate groups, it was the young people committing these hate crimes, and the leaders promoted them. And so we started a program about 25 years ago called Teaching Tolerance and Acceptance. Today we have 80,000 schools who use our material, and it goes to some, and we have some 500,000 teachers getting our magazine. It's a major program. We spend millions of dollars a year giving this material away to schools. And it's not a simple one-step solution. I think Dr. Wiley put her finger on all the things that have to happen. It's what we need a Democratic House and Senate working together to make happen in this country. At the Law Center, we concentrate on a lot of issues, but one is education. I told you the story about the Gen 6. Well, one of our lawyers adopted one of those young men from Jenner, Louisiana, and took him to New York and went to school in Connecticut. He had no chance in Jenner, but he went to New York, he went to a school in Connecticut, and this year he graduates from Hofstra University.
All right.
And he's working at Southern Poverty Law Center this summer as an intern. And to me, he was a lost person, a lost soul. He would have been who knows what in Jenner, Louisiana. We can't pick up all the people from Jenner and Homer, Louisiana, and Congressman Lewis, I wish he'd have sat here for a minute. I want to congratulate him. He was one of the founding board members of Southern Poverty Law Center, and people didn't know me from Adam's House Cat. And Julian Bond came along with John and stood by us and got it started. But he and I are from the same county. He's from Pike County. I'm from next door there in Montgomery County. And we both saw these things happen. But look at him, the opportunities he got to get out and make a name for himself. And that education is so critical. It is so critical. And we're at a period of time that I'm positive there's going to be some changes. We've got so many issues to deal with. Mass incarceration. We got a whole caste system of predominantly black males in prisons. We just got a judgment against the New Orleans parish prison. And the judge said it was the worst prison in the world. He couldn't think of one in a third world country any worse. Triple population, drugs being used. We have a video of a guy shooting up drugs and holding a handgun in the jail. So all these issues come together. They're the results of slavery, Jim Crow, lack of interest, and all these other things. And it's not just in the South this happens. New York City has a search policy. There was more violence created in Boston trying to integrate the schools than there was in Birmingham, Alabama. So it's a nationwide issue of race in our country, and it's good that we're addressing it now, and I hope that we don't have another Trayvon Martin happen anytime soon.
Thank you. To keep the dialogue going and keeping with our 1 minute admonition, we're going to go to 3 of our colleagues, ask them to do their 1 minute, then turn to the panel again, starting with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Congressman Butterfield, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
First of all, very quickly, let me thank the leadership and our chairwoman, Marcia Fudge. I think this is historic. I just simply want to say we want to be understood. Black women, black men, black children want to be understood, and we also want to be unrestrained when we talk about race. We have media pounding us in the conservative radio. So I know we want solutions, and here's my question. Sometimes they criticize Congress or any legislator in saying you can't be a social engineer. Well, we're a social engineer in Medicare and Medicaid. We prioritize that poor people need health care. What would be the response if we came together as a Congress and wrote an omnibus bill? And I recognize black girls, others need relief, but an omnibus bill dealing with African-American men and boys on the issues of education, on the issues of incarceration, on the issues of health care, and we literally debated it and had legislation. What would be the response? Would we be condemned, if you will, of here they go again, an omnibus initiative passing legislation signed by the president?
Right. Congressman Butterfield.
Thank you, Mayor. Let me thank the leader and Congresswoman Fudge and the Congressional Black Caucus for bringing us together this afternoon for this very important conversation. As most of my colleagues know, in my other life, I served as a trial judge down in North Carolina for 15 long years. During those 15 years, I probably presided over more than 2,000 felony jury trials. I probably sentenced 10 to 15,000 offenders over the years, and many of them, if not most of them, were African American. In charging defendants, police have a tendency to overcharge. And Morris, you know that so well. The police have a strong tendency to overcharge individuals who have been accused of committing crimes. And when these cases go to court, typically there's a plea bargain. And most of the charges are dismissed. 1 or 2 charges the defendant pleads to. He goes to prison for a short period of time, gets out, and then tries to find a job. The prospective employer then looks at the record, not just the convictions, but looks at the charges for which the defendant has been charged and then denies employment to the individual, believing that this individual has been convicted of burglary and breaking and entering when perhaps the defendant only pleaded guilty to trespassing. And that is a huge problem in minority communities across the country? And is there a congressional response? I know there's a state response, but states are unwilling to deal with this. Do you see a congressional response to expunging criminal records?
Thank you, Judge, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. Let me also thank our leader and our chair of the Congressional Black Caucus for this really very important and timely hearing. And also to all of our witnesses, thank you so much for your powerful testimony. To Dr. Wiley, it's so good to see you. Dr. Wiley and my son went to school together, and so we're so proud of you. And thank you for staying the course. Thank you for staying the course. You know, as a mother and as a grandmother, I just have to say, black parents, and Eugene, you talked about this a little bit, you know, no matter how well you prepare our young, especially black boys, for life, it'll never be enough. African Americans live their lives full of anxiety and stress constantly as a result of this, and this is not healthy. When you look, secondly, at poverty rates in the African American community, 28%, yet of course statistically there are more white people living in poverty than African Americans, the percentages are higher. Unemployment, 13.7%. Net worth, $5,600 in the African American community. Public sector job cuts, we lost 636,000 jobs since 2012. Dismantling the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, suspensions and expulsions. The education code is so vague, any young black boy can get kicked out for looking the wrong way if the school system believes that this is a behavioral issue. So let me just ask you, if we go back and look at how we address many of these issues, because it's very comprehensive and complex, institutional racism is very deep and it's very broad. But going back to Congresswoman Jackson's question, how do you think as members of Congress, in addition to our conversations that we must have, in fact, the Faith and Politics Institute, I want to mention, is conducting congressional conversations on race around the country now. But we have to act. And so how do we do this without being accused? And some of us don't really care if they accuse us of playing the race card. But race is a factor. And if we don't talk about race in every policy and everything we do, given our votes and given the policy decisions we make, how do we really frame this in a way that we can move forward? Because only in doing so will our country become stronger. We have to address race and justice.
Our panelists will respond.
Sure. Just to comment, if you say the word race, you are accused of playing the race card. So you are automatic. You are so accused. You know, it just happens. You know, there's such a touchiness, a knee-jerk reaction there. So what would happen to an omnibus bill addressing the condition of black men and boys in this country, which I happen to believe is a huge piece of unfinished business from the civil rights movement that is now getting worse rather than better, and that could be addressed specifically. But in this climate, I don't see it happen. I mean, do you see that happening? It doesn't mean that perhaps Congress shouldn't try, but I think certainly the legislative vogue and also my sense of what tends to be more possible these days are more comprehensive kinds of pieces of legislation based more on economics or on some other social indicators. That seems, I think, easier just to sell, frankly. The big question is, where do you get the money? And because what I have seen that works, programs that I have seen that work, attack problems from all angles. Because you've got education, you've got transportation, you've got to have employment prospects. There's psychology, there's health, there are all sorts of things that can be addressed, and that's very expensive to do. I did notice that U.S. corporations have like hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in profits parked overseas, and that there was, and I heard there was some talk about finding, some way to repatriate some of that money, and far be it from me just as a journalist, but if someone were to maybe think of some sort of partial amnesty, say, in exchange for a certain kind of investment of some of that money, maybe that would be a source of funding.
I appreciate the questions. They're very important. And I think there is, so obviously it's a question of will is very different from the question of should we. I think it's actually critically important that Congress, even if it's a slugfest, and it's a slugfest that is not won in a cycle, Congress should slug. Because the only way we make progress is by, I think, the bully pulpit of our elected officials being willing to call the questions. Because even when the legislation doesn't get passed initially, it starts a conversation. And if you look, I mean, we work at the Center for Social Inclusion in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Michigan, in California, in Washington State. And what I will tell you from sea to shining sea is there is more will out there than is being tapped, in part because we need the leadership to tap it. And so the more that Congress takes the leadership to say, we don't care if we can't necessarily get it done in this cycle, we have to start trying. And I would say, what are we trying on then? You know, I think that's part of the question. So let me say one thing is I think actually we do need we need a couple of things. We need data collection and transparency, right? Right now, one of the biggest ideological fights that's happening is whether and to what extent race matters. And I will tell you, running a research shop, we don't have enough data. We can see the anecdotal impacts and very little accountability because we can't quantify it. And if you're, by the way, this is true no matter your racial group. And it's extremely important for Native American populations, for Latino populations. It's important for all of us. And I think that's the other point. If we start thinking about how targeting of resources, and by the way, I would say targeting of resources in a way that recognizes race is not to be exclusive of people who are white. So I would not say that taking race into account means Appalachia should not get additional resources. I think Appalachia is deeply excluded. And we shouldn't pit ourselves, whether it's Detroit or Kentucky, right? That we say we should target resources to where we find the greatest disinvestment and the greatest need. And what we will then do, which we do not currently, I can tell you with broadband spending out of stimulus, that essentially what happens is communities of color get bypassed in race-neutral policy that has no intention of being unfair because it's not structured in a way to be fair. So I would say we have to take these issues on. Congress should fight. It will help the rest of us, particularly folks who are fighting down on the ground, to increase and improve the conversations. And just one thing I would add, because to Mr. Robinson's, I think, important point, I've gotten the hate emails too. And they're shocking. I mean, and they're flat out old school racist. One guy even calls himself Whitey, and his tweet tag is white power. So it's ugly, but I think the point is a lot of that's organized. A lot of that hate is organized hate. And so while it is frontal, I do not believe for a second it's the majority because I talk to way too many people. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to push forward and to push forward aggressively. And we should link across race to do it, to say we should pay attention to race and need collectively.
Before we move on, Mr. Dees, could you address Judge Butterfield's question about the expungement and the sentencing?
About expunging criminal things. Well, clearly when a person goes to prison and serves their term, no matter discharge, it's still on the record, it clearly should be expunged. That person should be allowed to vote, participate just like the rest of us in society. That's as clear gets. And it could be done in federal elections, and if it's done in federal elections, it'll happen in state elections. Which denies a lot of things. An ex-felon is very difficult. I'm trying to help a person now in that situation. Let me make a comment on your idea about global solutions here. The civil rights movement, in many ways, some might say, is over. And back when we looked at I understand what you're shaking your head, but I'm going to bring it clear here. When you look at the back of the bus in Montgomery when it was black, it was clear what the problem was. The Alabama State Troopers is all white. We solved those problems. Now buses come south by the hundreds bringing people to see the sights. They bring them to Montgomery, Birmingham, Memphis, all these places, Selma Bridge, to see these sites. And I always tell them to look into the waters of the Civil Rights Memorial Center that Ma Lin built for us, and you've been there. look at this, look at what you see. You see your face, you see your reflection, and the burden is on you. The civil rights, the march for justice continues. It's important to reframe this issue, though, in a way that it doesn't hark back to people thinking, well, we've been there and done that. I don't think anybody thought that a hate crime bill would be named after Matthew Shepard and James Byrd at the time he was killed. A gay man killed, beaten up. I don't think that it's going to be beyond expectation to hear a bill named for Trayvon Martin, whether it's an anti-profiling act or whatever it might be. Give us 4, 5, 6 years, and this thing will build in such a way that it'll happen. There are no simple solutions to this. But I remember when when I was in the back of my dad's pickup truck and coming from the cotton field to get a cold drink at the store, we got a bottle of whatever. After we drank it, I threw it at the first stop sign I could see along the highway, see if I could hit it. If I roll the window down now and we're going to drop a piece of trash out on the highway, my grandson would grab my hand and break it off. He wouldn't know way I'm going to do that. How did we solve that? We cleaned up America. You remember that Indian that stood by the road and a pop can rolled up against his foot, somebody threw out the window and that tear came down his eyes? We spent millions cleaning up the byways of America for trash. I think if we had a race to the top like we do with education and focused on this whole issue of inclusiveness, making America an inclusive community, then we can clean up the byways of racism along these ways too, just like we did. It's not simple. It's like dripping water on a rock, and it's frustrating. For this, and things like Trayvon Martin, you know, it's an assault on the justice system in so many ways. I don't mean a positive one. You guys got a big job in your hand, and you women on this committee, and I appreciate being here today. We're open at the Poverty Law Center to help you in any way we can.
Amen. Thank you. I'm going to just add to the rules of the game here. I'm going to go with 4 members at a time. We've got lots of questions, and we also have the time constraints. So Eddie Bernice Johnson, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Representative Ellison, and Representative Donna Christensen. So,
thank you very much. Let me leadership, as well as to you who have come. I have known of Mr. Dees for years and communicated from the great state of Texas.
no, then you have Frederica.
And Mr. Roberts, I see you all the time. and want to thank you for speaking out and doing what you do. There are so many questions in my mind that I really don't know where to start. I was sitting here thinking that when you come to a place like this, there's so much on your plate that you have to decide how you can concentrate on something to get something done. My major concentration has been on looking at research, innovation, and education. And as I look over the picture, it is very clear that is one of the outlets for the future. But it's getting more difficult, in a sense, to get there because we have the burden of student loans. If students can struggle through a bachelor's degree, they can't go to graduate school because the loan is too big to go on. And yet we're saying that a bachelor's degree today is like a high school education yesterday. We need more physicians if we're going to have the Affordable Health Care Act. We need more professors. We need more role models for our young people coming along. And you come to a place like this and think you can find the answer. But it's very, very difficult. You know what you like to do, but without the cry of the public, it's very difficult to achieve. I can appreciate the voices there. I can appreciate the fact that we struggle here. But what the public sees is not really the struggle and certainly not the results. The message that has gone out the last 5 years to young black men is don't try it. It's only going to be one. Don't try it. as long as that is the attitude, then what do we say to young black men? I have one son who has 3 sons, and 2 of my grandsons are out of college, and one is starting college. And they look at me sometimes and say, "Granny, why do you work so hard?" Because they really don't see much results of all that I talk about and all that I try to do. So I think that one of the things we have to do is continue to involve the public, to engage more people in understanding what it means now, because it seems to me that the powers to be learn what it means to vote, so they don't want us to vote. And so we get all of the negative coming from that. No matter what positive we reach for, there's a stumbling block put there. And so when we talk about the civil rights movement, I think it's just beginning. It seems to me that we've made strides, but we've made strides to the point where somebody else noticed we were making them, and now we got to stop them. And so I'm asking, what do we do about the organized, designed racism? Is there anything we can do? You know, you can go to certain networks, and that's all you hear.
Eddie, I love you to death.
Thank you.
But we got to get we got the question in? Okay. Eleanor?
I want to thank our leadership for this extraordinary opportunity to openly discuss this question, and for all the insights, and they were insights that you provided. Let me just say in a few minutes, the president had his own conversation after Trayvon Martin killing, and he rather much disparaged it from official forums, saying that in a real sense people had to do it where they are. Frankly, I think, at least in the African American community, you hear more. You hear less talk about it when I do something about it. So I'm not sure talk is where people are today. They talked when we went for the civil rights laws. We got the civil rights law. There was some progress. Now we're seeing something of a different order that does not lend itself to laws. And people are wondering whether or not we can be effective in producing anything practical. And I'm not so sure about race-based legislation, not only because I practice constitutional law, but because I think even the civil rights laws weren't race-based. You know, a white person can bring a civil rights case. It didn't have to be in order to get it passed. So why work that up in order to have to argue that? I see problems with boys, period. I think there are ways to get at what's happening to black boys. If you read the literature about how parents are worried about their white boys, I think you could in fact pass legislation affecting males and what has happened to them in this society. One has to, think deeply about these questions so that we can do something effective about it. Let me just raise 2 circumstances. When crack cocaine was raised, we did something about it, and it was race-based. Yeah, it applied to everybody, but its effects were so clearly on blacks, on Hispanics, people of color, that there has been some movement on that. And let me just suggest, with all of the energy in the air about Trayvon Martin, it has got to be there. A child shot down by a man who went unpunished. I don't see how, if at the end, this time next year, there's not been an effective movement, no matter where it gets, to do something about these stand your ground laws. I'm not sure there's any legacy for Trayvon Martin. I don't know what the Justice Department can do, but I know this: Trayvon Martin has a brother, a good-looking young black man who is a perfect role model for black men out there. I know that his parents are still in Florida. I know that the jury instructions, Mr. Robinson, he may have waived, stand your ground. The jury instructions had stand your ground because they had to have stand your ground because that is the law. I don't know why we shouldn't start with Florida to get rid of these stand your ground laws which are a clear and present danger to every black man who's walking in the streets today. It is a practical undertaking, just as crack cocaine was a practical undertaking, and because we would not let it go, we had some effect. Okay. If we keep talking about race and do not do something about it, even black people are not going to want to hear it.
Thank you, Eleanor. I have Keith Ellison and Donna Christensen.
My question, first of all, thank you all so much. But my question is this: how do we reach out to people who have racially resistant attitudes? I mean, just this much elaboration. I mean, everybody around this table loves to work out in a bipartisan way, and we all try to. We do, we really do. And yet, it just seems like there's so much resistance built up, and for every good argument you make, it's just dismissed or even laughed at sometimes. How do we talk to folks who are just racially resistant?
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you,
leadership. Just to say to Dr. Wiley, you'll be glad to know that the CBC has been on legislation that targets programs and funding to hard-hit communities for a couple of years, and we're not giving up. And then my first question, I think you've answered about how do we change implicit racism, and I think some of the responses have also responded to that. But I'm just concerned, how do we get to that workplace and the schools when our education system is where it is in so many of our communities? I want to read a quote from an article by Professor Vanilla Randall. The quote is really attributed to Professor Mary Douglas, and have you respond. When individuals disagree on elementary justice, their most insoluble conflict is between institutions. The more severe the conflict, the more useful to understand the institutions that are doing most of the thinking. Exhortation will not help. Passing laws against discrimination will not help. Only changing institutions can help. We should address them, not individuals, and address them continuously, not only in crises. And I think our opportunity is really to change those institutions. So those are my questions.
Thank you. I want to say a couple quick things. One, I used to live in South Africa. I spent 2 years there doing criminal justice reform. And one of the things that's clear is numerical diversity does not create justice. So I think it is important to know that just because we have a changing demographic, I agree that it's creating a lot of insecurity, particularly given the economic situation. That alone will not produce a more just society. We have to act into it. The other thing I want to just say quickly so we've talked about the importance of expungement. One quick point is that there's a study that shows that black people with no criminal record and a bachelor's degree actually get fewer jobs than white people with criminal degrees. I mean, with a criminal record. That's not to say that white people with criminal record do not need expungement, because they do. But I just want to note that this isn't all about, this is part of the implicit bias. The other thing I just want to note is the Sentencing Project has actually demonstrated in a recent report that the increase in incarceration rates are actually women. So I think it actually is critically important to understand, and black women and Latinas in particular. So it is important to understand how we are all positioned. Black men are gendered, as women are, but in different ways. But just to speak to the questions, how do we talk? We have to start with our shared needs. We all need to see a doctor when we're sick. It feels the same to lose your home to foreclosure. Right? We're starting with an emotional connection about how, because we are all living at a time of scarcity. People who are white in this country are not okay. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we say we need to fix that. And when we do, what we have seen is that it opens people up to a willingness to say, oh, you seem like a reasonable person. You're acknowledging my pain. You recognize it's about all of us. To then say, yeah, and let's talk about how we're also, some of our boats have a few more holes in them, right? We don't, so when we fix the problems we have to look at how they need to be fixed across our differences. And it should help us all, right? So I just want to share that because I think that's not the way we are currently talking. And I am not suggesting that given the current state of redistricting, which is really the reality I think that Congress is facing right now, is that we have congressional districts that do not reflect the country. And that's part of the problem, and it's a structural one. But the reason that gives me hope is because that means that we can still have conversations about what needs to shift, even though there's some gridlock in Congress, because we've frankly locked in some districts that don't reflect the way America looks, right? They're not as diverse as the nation. And therefore, the conversations we have don't cross the racial lines in the way we need to. And your leadership can do that.
If I could just speak briefly to Congressman Holmes Norton's excellent points. I agree that talk isn't what people are necessarily looking for. I mean, people are looking for action. And I think that's a very good point, that people are looking for action, results, and so make it specific, and maybe the specific is a stand your ground law. But to your point about black boys or program for all boys, here's the difference, and here's why there's a kind of a problem there. Just a brief story. I have two sons. One, both of them grew up in the suburbs. One, who's now 30, when he was in high school, he has a deep voice like mine, and so I answer the phone one day, and it's one of his friends, a white kid who thinks it's my son Aaron. And so I pick up the phone and say hello, and he's like, "Yo, what's up, dog?" You know, and it sounds like he's straight out of Compton, you know. And I said, "Oh, this is Mr. Robinson." He says, "Oh, hello, Mr. Robinson." You know, like Eddie Haskell on the Leave It to Beaver show. You know, he's like all of a sudden he's just, and it struck me, and so I had one of these periodic conversations with Aaron and his brother that I have about how society understands that when your friend Rick talks like that, it's a pose, or it's a phase, or it's a costume that he wears when his jeans are slouched and this and that at some point he'll take off the costume and move out of the face and go off and be a lawyer or something like that. And society doesn't necessarily assume that about you. You know, you can do all those things, and you can take that, but people are not going to necessarily assume that it's just a disguise. It's just you're a poseur, like your friend Rick, which is what he was, right? I mean, this is, you know, these are kids who were about as soft could be, but there are a lot of situations in which that's not the assumption that would be made, and so to your question, Congresswoman Johnson, what do you say to young black men, to black boys? And you say, you know, what I said was, this is not fair, but this is the way it is, and we can complain about it, you know, and I'll share your pain, and I'll tell you my stories, and you tell me your stories. But we got to move past it, okay? And I'll help you any way I can. But no, it's not fair. But yes, it is the way it is.
Congressman Ellison, I'll try to answer your question. How do you reach out to a person with racist attitudes? Well, that was most of my kinfolks back in Alabama. And you know, the black people that I picked cotton with in the cotton fields, my daddy was a tenant farmer. We didn't own any land. They had to leave. I've been practicing law 52 years. I'm 77 this year, so you can know the time frame. They had to leave and go north for jobs. And when they came home, they told me, I think I like the southern people who are overtly racist versus the northern people who got all this implicit bias. And you know, I find the person with the implicit bias probably harder to convince because, like you say, they don't even feel they're racist. On the other hand, overt racists, to me, are the easiest people to talk to because I find that because I simply, you know, we got these shared interests, and once I start talking to them, and they'll listen, and you know, they got only one way to go, and that's to change. These people with implicit bias, you got to educate them on what they're even thinking about. But we haven't won a single lawsuit against hate groups in this country that I didn't have some of the members of the hate group testifying for us. I actually, started out as doing a little Southern Baptist preaching when I was 16 years old, and I call myself bringing them to the foot of the cross. I show them that their ways are wrong, and all these cases I've been able to get these young people to see that they're wrong. Something happened last week, probably hadn't gotten to y'all's attention, but the largest hate bulletin board posting thing in America is called Stormfront. Stormfront has 250,000 registered users run by Don Black, who's married to David Duke's widow. And Don Black's son, born into that, and he's 23 or 4 years old now. He had a radio show, unbelievable racist. He sent us about a 4-page email to the Southern Poverty Law Center last week renouncing his racism and saying he apologized to all the people, gays, and everybody else that he had put down. So I think there's great opportunities to find people like this young man and people who make changes to be a spokesperson to convert some of these racists.
We're now going to be able to move to our final 4 questioners of the afternoon. We appreciate the patience of the panel and our colleagues. Congressman Ted Deutsch, Congressman Gregory Meeks, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and Ms. Wilson's no longer with us. And so it'll be 3.
Great, thanks. Thanks to the leader and Steering and Policy Committee and CBC for hosting this. There are so many issues that you raised that I'd like to talk about, but Marcy, you talked about how the March for Justice continues, and Maya, you talked about, and I love this, the need to find non-competitive community activity, but we struggle enough finding community activities at all. So how do we both broaden that to include, to be more inclusive, but beyond that, with all of and everything you laid out, Eugene, and that you write about, and I mean, just today, all the discussion about drug laws and incarceration rates and adequate representation and profiling and everything else, how do we make that March for Justice relevant for people? And in particular, how do we make it relevant for all of the young people for whom marriage equality has become so, it's self-evident to them that this is an issue that everybody should grasp, that why is this controversial? How do we make the struggle for civil rights and the fact that that's not over and this March for Justice continues, how do we help them see that the same way?
Thank you, Ted. Representative Greg Meeks.
Go ahead on, sir. Excuse me.
We're actually going to have the questions first, then go to the answers, if we could. Thank you, Mr.
Race
Dees.
is so deep that we've got to, for example, I get nervous sometimes because when we talk with issues that we're talking about here, everyone having a right to an education, everyone having equal opportunity, etc. Those are all things that we need to do to stop the institutional racism. But one of the things that I'm afraid of in talking to a young black boy that I was just with today was thinking that they needed to do those things so they could be accepted, where it looks like you're trying to make them do something so they can be accepted by somebody. That's just the right thing to do. And when you have an individual, everybody in this room, I know when I go on Fox television, talk about racism, the response that I get from my office gets on the telephone and the kind of hate mail that I get just from basically going on a television show, that's the kind of racism that I think that we're talking about, where even a member of Congress feels comfortable telling the President of the United States, you lie? I don't think that would have happened if there was another president other than Barack Obama. So that's the deep kind of institutional, and so my question is just this. Our job is to try to fix that, but when you have the Supreme Court saying that diversity, and they're reversing a lot of the diversity rules, then it does make one seem that what can we do? We're trying to get there too. So with the laws that are being passed, well, the rulings that the Supreme Court is making in regards to reversing some of the gains that were made just a short while ago, what is done in that regards, and where we got to go, for example, in New York with stop and frisk laws.
All right, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky is our final question, and we'll go to the panel.
Thank you. Morris Dees, I think I get mail from you about every other week. So it's a pleasure to meet you in person, and what a wonderful panel. Thank you to our leaders. I want to mention two women with the last name Alexander. One is Marissa Alexander, who, as far as I know, she's still sitting in jail in Florida, having shot a warning shot, no one hurt, into the ceiling because her abusive husband was threatening her, and stay on your ground did not apply to this African-American woman and with her threat by the African-American husband. It just drives me crazy. I think there needs to be something done about that. So that's really one question about what to do. But the Michelle Alexander and the new Jim Crow, I'm sure you talked about it. I'm sorry I was late. But the war on drugs is a complete failure in every sense. I mean, there's more drugs in the white suburbs in my district. There's a new heroin wave, and this is all white, and the problem, it seems to me and seems to her, is that once you get that felon label, this is a lifelong sentence. You mentioned more as voting, but it's not just voting. It's public housing. It's all kinds of benefits. You are marginalized for life, and the prisons are full of. So I mean, it seems to me that we have not concentrated enough on that, intentional or not. She calls it the new Jim Crow. Even if there isn't intent, the effect is so clear, and we really haven't dealt with the mass
Jan.
incarceration.
Thank you, Jan, for that. We'll have our panel respond, please.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to cede to Mr. Dees because he has a plane to catch. So
no, that's okay.
Oh,
don't worry about that.
Go ahead,
I'm not
Morris.
leaving until tomorrow if I have
to.
Okay. This is an honor to be up here.
We're happy that you're
here. I
here.
just whispered that to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so pleased that you raised Marissa Alexander, because actually there are people starting to organize around her case. And I think to your point, and others' points, organizing against stand your ground laws, because 34% of whites who shoot someone who is not white are exonerated by stand your ground. 3% of people who are black are exonerated under stand your ground. So that's obviously another example of the way the system is not functioning in a fair way, even if someone's not thinking that they're doing or treating Marissa Alexander unfairly, right? So what do we do about it? Again, I think the point about activities. First of all, and I don't know everyone's district, but actually leadership can bring together people in activities that are non-competitive, and to have a conversation about the policy solutions that will support more of it. So I think that is something that is important to do. I will go back to my statements about continuing to fight for both the laws that make it unfair to behave this way. Let me just say one thing about the U.S. Department of Justice. Said that it would be very difficult to bring a hate crimes suit against George Zimmerman because he did not hurl a racial epithet. And what we know from the social sciences, you don't have to. There are several other kinds of indicators as to whether or not there was hate involved. But the law does not reflect that social science. As lawmakers, one of the things you can do is press that those evidentiary standards in law, right, need to be changed to catch up to 2 decades of established social science. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Others on the panel?
I would just, first of all, that's fascinating, I think. On the question of what can be done, given the climate, given your email and my email and Maya's email and Lord knows Morris's email over the course of since before there was email, and given the current political climate. And I would just note that those who control state houses and governorships get to draw congressional districts every 10 years, and also get to write state laws or unwrite state laws, and it's harder, it's more diffuse, but I think both parties will be focused a lot on those state contests, and maybe not enough attention has been paid to them. But that's going to be crucial. You know, I mean, the congressional districts are what they are and are going to be what they are, or probably not a lot better until there's another census.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. Mr. Dees, you want to wrap up for us?
Real quick, I just say we got to elect a Democratic Congress, House and Senate, and a Democratic president, and that's going to be the solution to this problem in the long run.
Well, so you couldn't improve on that. Before we close, I think we want to ask our chair of the CBC to give us some concluding comments before we go to our
I just want to say thank you to our witnesses. I want to say thank you to all who participated, and especially thank you to the leader and to the chairs. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, because my daughter does have a plane to catch, I will be brief, Christine. I want to join the distinguished chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and acknowledging the excellence of the presentations you made today, but more important to that, how you have led on these important issues, and they are central to our ever forming a more perfect union. So we look forward to continuing our work with you on these important issues to our country. Morris Dees, thank you. You're an icon in this country, and we salute your leadership. Maya, just dazzling in terms of your TV and the rest. And Eugene, of course, thank you for all that you do. Now, I'll compare my emails with anybody's emails. I know. But let me acknowledge how quickly the leadership of our Steering and Policy Committee, Chairman Rob Andrews and Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro brought us together today with such excellent testimony with so many of our members. Thank you. Thank you, Steering and Policy Committee.
Thank you. We did want to acknowledge Doug Tanner's presence, and thanks for what the Faith in Politics Institute has done.
Doug Tanner, Faith in Politics.